And I like this activity because it makes me feel like it's like my own version of like the red string detective board that you see in movies, but it's about my life and about my work. I think of journaling and writing as investigation. It's like a detective game and you're learning about yourself. And the goal is to make connections about yourself that you haven't made before. This is a video about digital journaling and how to digital journal. Clarification, I don't think that this will replace like an analog, actual, real paper journal, but I think it's a very useful secondary tool and you can do things digitally that you can't do here, and that's why I feel like you should use both of them. So my main thing, the very obvious thing, is that you can use web images on a digital journal that you can't do in here unless you like print it out and stick it in, but like no one's gonna do that. So I've been using this program called Scribble, which is what I'm using here, and what I like about it is that there's an infinite canvas feature. It's that feature where like if you zoom in or like you zoom out, like as long as you keep zooming out, the page will keep expanding to like fit the contents of like what you're writing. I really like that because it's the feature that I wish I could have on an actual book, where like the page will just stretch out forever for like as long as you want to write on that same page. Because the annoying thing about writing is that sometimes I feel like when I'm writing on a physical journal, sometimes, you know, like when the page is filled up and you want to continue on the same page, like you don't necessarily want to flip to the next page, because when you're writing on one page you're kind of in like a flow state, right? But then when you flip the page, because you're like out of room to do it, it just kind of like pulls you out of the thought that you were having, and it pulls you out of the flow, and then it ends up feeling kind of disjointed and it makes the thought less clear than you had it in your head, especially if you're like brainstorming or thinking of ideas, because like a lot of the times when the other things you wrote can't be like written down like next to the previous thought that you had, and it's not like immediately in your line of sight, you like kind of forget about them, and then you can't make some of the connections that you would have with like an idea you had at the beginning with like an idea you had near the end, because you can't like see everything on one page, right? You'd have to flip the page to like get to the next thing. And I feel like that's kind of annoying because it means that I'm not making like the connections that I can, because I'm not seeing everything and I'm not like identifying them. Maybe I'm like a baby with like no object permanence. Does anyone else have this issue, or is it just a me problem? So Scribble is really useful for this because you can zoom in, you can zoom out, especially because you like move things around, because again, it's not on like an actual page. It means that like if you end up connecting ideas when you're brainstorming and you find like a new connection, you can kind of just like move it around so that it's coherent. And I like it because actually, weirdly enough, you would think that like digitally it means it's like less organic, but like actually, because you can move things around, I feel that actually it makes it more intuitive, and then you can kind of like, it takes the pressure off, right? Because you're like, it's not like I'm writing in pen, I'm writing in pencil, I have to like, when I make a mark, I have to like commit to that mark, you know what I mean? I think it's better for like problem solving and brain solving because you can move things around. So this is a good idea that you could try on Scribble, which is I started doing this board, and it's not really like journaling as much as it is investigation. If you've seen my previous journaling videos, you would know that like I think of journaling and writing as investigation. It's like a detective game and you're learning about yourself, and the goal is to make connections about yourself that you haven't made before. So specifically on this board here, I've started making a board about like the different sources of inspiration that I have, and I've started making connections between them. So it's not done, and I don't think it'll ever be done, right? But like the beauty of using something online is that even though it's not done and I want to add to it later, I can just scroll out of the canvas, you know? Like I like the infinite thing, and then I don't have to do on a book and be like, okay, I'm gonna like have to, you know, I'll have to separate out as many pages I need to so that I make sure I have room if I want to add something. You know, you don't have that issue anymore. But basically what I did on this board is that I'm trying to make a note of everything, which is a main source of inspiration for me, artistically or philosophically or in life, or something that I'm very interested in. So how I started this was I basically started with like one idea and then I expanded outwards. I think I started with SZA, I can't remember. I think I started with SZA and then I expanded out. So like SZA writes a lot about love, which is a big driving factor in my life, right, as all girls do. And then I started thinking about like, is it love or is it limerence? And you know what I mean? So like you keep going and then you can kind of make a nice connection there. And I like this activity because it makes me feel like it's like my own version of like the red string detective board that you see in movies, but it's about my life and about my work. And also it's just cool to see like connections about your interests and your hobbies. And once you start looking for the connections on this board, you can find that like at the beginning maybe you don't really know where to go off to, but like the more you do it, you'll find that it gets easier to find more and more of them. It made me think of like new things that I had previously forgotten about, but making the connection sparked the memory in my head. And they can get quite elaborate. So for example, I started off talking about like fashion, just fashion in general, like women's fashion, right? So like very normal, like standard stuff like Marc Jacobs. I really like Marc Jacobs. So So I started thinking about that. I started thinking about fashion. I like Alexa Chung, and then I started thinking about Tavi Gevinson, who's a very popular fashion blogger for teens. So I was like, who's like a famous collaborator of Tavi Gevinson? Petra Collins is good friends with Tavi Gevinson, and Petra Collins is a photographer. You've definitely seen her work. She does a very beautiful, very dreamy photography style. She's one of my favorite photographers of all time. And then from that, I was like, who reminds me of Petra Collins' work? Sofia Coppola, the filmmaker. Sofia Coppola, like Marie Antoinette, you know, the French queen. I was actually very interested in French history. That's very interesting. I wonder why that would have come about from the other things that I'm interested in. I had a phase where I was like really into like French-Russian aristocratic relations. Is that a bit specific? Going back to Petra Collins, another thing that I really like about her is that I really like dreamy, dark, moody cinematography. I really like that aesthetic. I really like when photographers are able to create that experience. So one of my favorite movies that is underrated is Atlantics, and it has this very haunted look. And there's big themes about the sea, and it's about love, and it's about loss. That's a movie I really enjoyed, but specifically because of how it's shot and the aesthetic of it. And that movie takes a lot of symbols and inspiration from this Polish artist, Aleksandra Wałaszewska, and she does these really creepy horror style creatures in paintings, which I think is beautiful. And that's something I'm really drawn to, and that reminds me of Hrana Spach from Garden of Earthly Pleasures. Do you see how this is working? You know how it's like you start with one thought and then you keep going, right? And then you kind of like figure out like on the way all these like little signposts of things that you're like, oh, I really like that. I wonder why that is. And then you realize it's because it has themes and like connections with other things that you're interested to, and then you realize that like it's not that you have a bunch of like random disjointed interests and you don't understand how they come about. It's actually that like your interests will often remind you of like your other interests, and that's why you like them. So continuing on from that, you know, Garden of Earthly Pleasures, Aleksandra Wałaszewska, I really like this dark fantasy type idea. And then I started thinking about like a lot of like modern video games I really enjoy, which are like horror themed, is because they have this kind of unsettling, atmospheric, foggy, moody style to it. So for example, Silent Hill or like Fatal Frame, they have this like look to it which is very unsettling. And also I like Fatal Frame because of the outfits, right? Y2K core, fashion, mood spo. And then Fatal Frame, which is like the movement of like the character design. It's like The Sims, where like that weird like PS2 aesthetic where the characters look really blocky and kind of weird. I really like that for some reason. And then going from Silent Hill, I realized that what I really like about Silent Hill is the setting, right? It's not about the story, it's not about the characters to me. It was about the setting and how unsettling it was. And I like the kind of gray aesthetic, and I realized, oh, actually, I really like brutalism architecture, right? And then I started thinking about architecture, and then I expanded out in architecture. So you see how like one little thing can like get you into like a really weird place. Like I don't know anyone else that would have made the connection between Soviet brutalism architecture and like Final Fantasy, the Japanese video game, and then have it all draw back to like Marie Antoinette and Sofia Coppola, you know what I mean? You know that website like Boil the Frog on Spotify, where it like gives you a playlist of like the connection between this artist and this artist? That's what I've been doing on like this Skrintle board, and I think it's been like really interesting, and you realize that like everything actually is connected and all your interests are connected. But yeah, you can see some of the other connections that I've made, so they can get like very far off. And so the only rule when you're doing this is that each like little signpost, each little bubble that you make, it has to be something you're actually interested in. And it's interesting because you do like discover that you are actually like not like a little trope, and you're a real person. And so you can have wildly different interests. You know how like if you're talking to someone who doesn't know you that well and they have like an idea of like what hobbies and interests you are. So for example, like people think I'm very like quiet and reserved, and so they think, oh, she likes to draw, and like that's the only like defining characteristic that people have of you. But like there's layers to every person, right? So like you could start talking to someone and they seem like a corporate finance man, but in their day-to-day they also collect rare orchids or like miniature trains, you know what I mean? This reminds me of that time I went to an Italian restaurant in Kensington, and you wouldn't be able to tell from the outside, right? But like when you walk inside, the entire inside is Princess Diana themed, and you're like, that's shocking, I didn't realize this was inside of you this entire time. Is this analogy making sense to you? Point is that we're all multifaceted. This board is a good idea to like help discover all of your interests and your multifacetedness. So yeah, infinite canvas is very useful for big picture stuff. But I think a lot of the tools on Skrintle have like different uses, and they're all quite useful. So obviously my physical journal, I think, is for the intimate details, right? Because It's about like sitting down with nothing else, like no other stimuli, and like just writing and then discovering something, and you can talk about things in very intimate detail. There's like a tradition and there's a heritage to keeping a physical journal, right, over centuries, and I think that obviously you should continue doing that. I think the physical journal is for like daydreaming, and it's also about like the little scrap ideas that you can have at any given point that don't necessarily connect to anything else, or it's like an idea that you need to write down that you don't want to use right away, right? The digital version is good for like holistic thinking and having a holistic view of things, because you can expand and shrink, right? And you can make links to other pages. You don't have to work on like this 2D big giant canvas, right? You can work on a different page, and then you can work in 3D, right? Because it's like 3 dimensions. And also, a lot of you in the comments of my previous commonplace book were talking about how you felt a lot of pressure to like not mess up your journals, which I think that's like an issue in itself that you still need to address, and you need to like do it properly. But like, I'll do that in a different video, right? But I think a digital thing can definitely help you, because if you have like paper journal anxiety, it doesn't mean that you should stop making notes and connections in your day-to-day life because you can't make them on a physical journal, right? A digital journal is a very good tool to do that. And I feel like at any point you should still have a place where you have like no pressure to like make work and like go through your thoughts. And until you can bring yourself to do that comfortably in a journal with like no pressure, a digital version is also amazing. I think also, if you're like me and you don't have a lot of organization and you don't necessarily want a lot of organization, a digital journal can be very useful because you can use the control find tool. In my physical journals, right, I'll admit I quite like the task of like having to flip through and like find exactly what it is that I'm looking for. I do kind of like the chaos of not exactly knowing exactly where everything is. But also, I feel like sometimes if you want to like actually find stuff, control find is very useful, unless you make a typo, in which case don't, but like the point still stands, right? I enjoy that a digital journal can allow me to be an organized chaos. So the ability to make links to other pages from like the big black hole of like big mood board and stuff makes it chaos, which is like organized in some way, right? It just has to make sense to you. And also the tag feature is really useful because it means you don't have to like put things in like physical folders like on your desktop. So if you like tag something, you can tag it like a lot of things. So like you can tag like this post, you can tag it like a writer or Joan Didion, this specific writer. But if you also want to like tag other things and you want to find your other posts that are also tagged writer, then you can just like search for it and then it pulls it up for you. I've also been using digital journaling for brainstorming YouTube videos. So I've got an upcoming video about like what's in my bag, and I'm using it to get kind of a visual identification of where I want to go with things, right? So I really want to talk about Joan Didion, I really want to talk about Georges Perec. I want to see the images that I'm going to use that are going to inspire me for this new video. Anyway, I hope I convince you on the fact that you should get a digital journaling platform alongside a physical notebook. If any of you are interested in Scrintl, which is what I'm using here, I have a personal link that you can click on in the description. You should click on that one instead of going to the website. You should use that one. Also, if you use the code Crystal10, then you get 10% off a personal pro account, and the code only works for the 4 weeks from the day on which this video is posted, so go do it while it's still able to be used. If you want to know more about my thoughts about analog journaling and how to keep a messy notebook, you can